Well, you've figured out that you've got too many bad bugs in your gut. Is that an infection or is that an overgrowth? And does it even really matter? Hey guys, I am Dr. Arland Hill, and today we're going to talk about this differentiation between infection and overgrowth and why it actually does matter how we classify the accumulation of problematic bacteria in your gastrointestinal tract, what we would typically term more specifically as dysbiosis. Now, to help us understand where we want to go with this conversation and why it does make a difference is that there's not only a philosophical difference here, but there's also a difference in terms of the type of organisms that we would classify as an infection versus an overgrowth. And then what's important for you to understand is that that differentiation is also going to impact the type of treatment options that you have to control that accumulation of bacteria, and as well as influence the long-term decision making that you're going to make around your current state of health as well. So with that being said, I think the easiest place to start us off with is by defining infection. And once we have a definition, once we have an understanding of infection, then we can start to make sense of how that differs from an overgrowth. So an infection is an invasion of bodily tissues by a pathogenic organism that typically results in damage to the tissues that can progress towards disease if left unchecked. Now, with all of that being said, the key word that we need to focus on in all of that is pathogen. Now, I like to say this to my patients in that when I make the word or make mention of the word pathogen, there's typically nothing positive that comes to mind when someone hears that name. And if we're just talking in regards to pathogens that are typically associated with the gastrointestinal tract, you'll recall of hearing names, maybe you've heard these names in the news of things like salmonella, cholera. You know, some of these conditions, Clostridium difficile or C. diff as it's often termed, these are the kind of names that we hear when we start to think about pathogens. And many times the intervention, these are bacterial pathogens, many times the intervention on these pathogens is very aggressive. It's typically an antibiotic or a combination of antibiotics to manage these. And the idea is that we want to eradicate the pathogen. And that's a key concept here that I need you to not overlook. We want to eradicate the pathogen and completely remove it from the gastrointestinal tract, because that is not an organism as a pathogen that should inherently be there. So, how does that differ from an overgrowth? Well, in an overgrowth, and we're specifically, to give you some context here, I'm going to be talking about this in terms of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, what is often termed as SIBO, S-I-B-O, and how I will refer to that in the remainder of this video. But SIBO is an overgrowth, as the name implies with that O. Overgrowths in this context are not composed of pathogens. More realistically, they're composed of what are generally considered opportunistic organisms. And so these are organisms that are inherently found in the gastrointestinal tract. It's not out of place to find these organisms in the gastrointestinal tract. These typically go by such names, and this is not by any means meant to be a conclusive list, but things like staph and strep and E. coli species come into this. There's Escherichia species, there's enterococcal species, Klebsiella species. So the species point, the different names is not that important. What's important here that you want to focus on is that it's not uncommon to see these in the gastrointestinal tract. And so they're opportunists. But here's the problem, is that when they start to break over a certain threshold, that's when that overgrowth is coming into play. And so now we've got organisms that are typically found in the GI tract, but they're just accumulating above what their normal levels are. And so that's different, remember, from an infection, because an infection is going to be composed of organisms that should not be in the gastrointestinal tract in any quantity. And so we see the difference there. Now, when you look at these overgrowths, one of the things to consider is that overgrowths don't have to be eradicated. Eradicated meaning complete elimination here. We just need to get an overgrowth back under a given threshold to ultimately create an asymptomatic, to make it where you're asymptomatic, not bloating, not gas, not painful distension in the stomach, not seeing changes in your bowel motility, either constipation or diarrhea. Can go both ways or can even be mixed, right? We're not seeing that kind of stuff. So how do we deal with just reducing these numbers? Well, typically when you're dealing with an infection, you're mostly targeting one, maybe two organisms. With an overgrowth, you're generally targeting multiple organisms. And there are cases where, and the standard of care here is going to be antibiotics, but an equally effective intervention on this is going to be botanicals. Maybe you call these herbals, but these botanicals can be used in multiple combinations. And because you're dealing with multiple organisms, multiple combinations becomes an effective route by which to deal with these, right? So it does influence the intervention and how aggressive you have to be and what outcome you're trying to reach, right? So we're not trying to eradicate when we're talking about an overgrowth. We're trying to get them under a threshold. We can use botanicals and use those very effectively, and we want to use combinations of botanicals so we can hit that combination of different microbes, right? Now, here's another key difference. When we talk about eradication, once we've achieved that eradication of that pathogenic organism, the job is done, so to say. In the case of SIBO and this overgrowth, once we've gotten those numbers back under threshold, the job is not done. In fact, in many cases, the job is just starting at this point. This is where the real work comes in and where we want to really put some effort to make sure that we don't get into our relapse scenario. So after we get back in an overgrowth scenario, once we've got the bacteria under this threshold, so where things in the gut are normal, they're balanced, we need to think about, how do we secrete enough acid? How do we secrete enough enzymes? How do we produce and secrete enough bile? How do we maintain the motility through our GI tract in an optimal time frame? These are all the things that need to be dealt with in the overgrowth conversation to make sure that the overgrowth scenario does not become this redundant pattern where you deal with the overgrowth, you bring the overgrowth back under threshold, and then a few months later, you're right back there again, you have the overgrowth. You control it again, and then you have the overgrowth, and you just get into this relapse of a cycle. So the mentality is, and what's important for you is, don't treat your overgrowth like an infection, whereas you intervene with the treatment against the infection and then you're done. When you intervene with the antimicrobials against the overgrowth, keep in mind your work is just beginning, and now you've got to dig in and find out, why did I develop this overgrowth in the first place? And as it relates to SIBO, and in contrast to an infection, infections and the organisms that come along with those pathogenic infections, pathogenic organisms, you typically contract those as a result of exposure. Like, let me just use salmonella. Like, maybe you ate salmonella, and as a result of that, it proliferated, and now you've got that infection. That's not generally the case when we're talking about, and that's really not the case when we're talking about overgrowths. Overgrowths are going to be the byproduct of these systems, these digestive secretions in the GI tract not working efficiently, and then also the motility of the bowels being abnormal. So to ultimately control that overgrowth, we have to also control these digestive secretions and the motility. So part of the question is, how do I do that? And we'll dig into those conversations in other videos, but I just want you to make sure that you're not treating your bad bacteria accumulation, and I'm kind of using bad bacteria in air quotations here because that's a bit of a naive way to look at this, meaning simply that the conversation is more complex than that. But point to get this under control, to help you be asymptomatic, don't treat your overgrowth as an infection. So to understand more about how to support your gastrointestinal tract, guys, make sure you go to some of the other videos that I have on the channel here. Take a look at those. Those are going to help explain what's going on in your gastrointestinal tract and start to give you ideas about how to intervene and what to do with this. So until next time, I will see you guys soon. Take care.